new evidence so that we always understand what works, what doesn't, and why it works or doesn't work. By doing that, we try to create an actionable evidence base for improving healthcare, working collaboratively with patients, staff, and other stakeholders. The focus is on healthcare improvement broadly. We have a number of focus areas. So, for instance, maternity care, mental health, primary care, and as of the start of this year, also data science and technology, which is the area that I lead. And obviously, all these things very much also apply to the situation where we try to innovate healthcare services using technology. So that's where I fit in. And I've been here now for about 9 months, and almost 10 actually. And I feel quite at home. So, for instance, it's raining very hard this afternoon. And people always told me in Cambridge the weather is so much better. That's nonsense. It's just not true. It's the same, I can tell you that. So yeah, settling in really, really well. I haven't moved yet. I still live in Stockport, but I typically spend my weeks, working weeks in Cambridge, and then back at home during the weekends in Stockport. Sometimes I'm actually on campus at Oxford Road, but today I had to be in Cambridge for an in-person meeting this morning. So that's the reason we're doing this online. So this lecture, I've got 3 topics. So the first is the last mile problem, which has also been called the AI chasm. So the implementation challenges that we face with AI in healthcare. Then we're going to talk about the healthcare AI algorithm journey. And finally, I'm going to discuss some of the findings of a review that we conducted earlier this year about healthcare AI implementation, so a literature review. So basically that's summarizing what is it that we know about this topic, and I will finish with some take-home messages. So let's start with that first topic, the AI chasm. And you've probably seen some of these headlines or papers. So this one was from the pandemic, or appeared shortly after the pandemic, was in MIT Technology Review, and said hundreds of AI tools have been built to catch COVID, and none of them helped. And none of them helped because none of them was actually deployed in clinical practice. And this was a finding from a large review that was published in the British Medical Journal. I think, in actual fact, it was a little bit more nuanced than that, because some of those tools were actually deployed, but it was a very small percentage. Sorry? Could you go on mute, please? So this was during the pandemic, but actually it wasn't a new phenomenon. So here's a review that was published in 2016 by Klein-Rauwler and colleagues. And this was a systematic review of papers that reported the development of prognostic models in obstetrics. So looking at outcomes like preeclampsia, preterm delivery, mode of delivery, gestational hypertension, etc. Interestingly, they found that the performance of newer models, which, some of which used machine learning rather than statistical methods, was generally not better than that of older models predicting the same outcome. But they also found that very few developed models were externally validated. And the impact of models on clinical practice was never evaluated. So 263 models, 177 papers, none of the models was evaluated in clinical practice. And for that reason, at the time, I'm not sure whether it has changed now, it's now 2024, obviously. None of these models currently recommended by clinical guidelines, because we just don't have any evidence that they make a difference in clinical practice. So that was in 2016. Here's another one. This one is in mental health, and this appeared in 2021. So identified 88 prediction modeling studies in psychiatry. And they included only models that included some form of validation. So there were more, but they didn't include those in this review. So the most frequently investigated condition was psychosis, and that was followed by mood and affective disorders and anxiety disorders. They found that from those 88 models, 27 had been externally validated, which is the type of validation that we'd like to see before we take things to clinical practice. And only one model had been implemented in clinical practice. So again, the same story really. So few models are externally validated. Hardly any models, sometimes no models, are taken to clinical practice. We see the same picture if we look at the global clinical artificial intelligence dashboard. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's a dashboard that automatically scrapes the literature on AI or clinical AI or AI for healthcare. And we can see that there's been an enormous growth of the number of papers on healthcare AI in the last 5 to 10 years. But the number of mature studies, so studies where healthcare AI was evaluated in clinical practice, it has grown as well, but surely not as fast. And the gap is clearly widening. So there's very little of the work on the development of models that makes it along the translational pathway to clinical practice, or at least to some form of clinical testing even. So why is this happening? What is the problem here? Some people have said, probably in many cases, the aim in the first place was just to publish a nice paper about AI, about a new AI model or algorithm, and there was no intention to take that to clinical practice in the first place. So it's not surprising that it didn't happen. And I think that's definitely part of the problem. So the incentive for academic researchers is to publish a paper and not to go through all those other, terrible, challenging steps to get things into clinical practice. But I don't think it is the entire story. It's part of the story, but if you look at the numbers, which are really devastating, then I can't believe that that's the full story. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, to quote the cartoon on this slide. So one area where we can get some inspiration to think about this problem is from translational research. So here's a diagram that was published 10 years ago by Gannon, and that is actually used by UKRI, for instance, or a variant of this, but quite similar. And it's also used by Translation Manchester, this one, to conceptualize, what the journey is of new interventions from biomedical discovery to clinical implementation. And, what the diagram tells us is that, we typically go from basic research, discovery research, so it's T1 and T2, where initially there's not even a disease focus or projected practical application. We then go to the phase of development of something that has this disease focus and aims to address a practical problem. So development of a proof of concept, typically in vitro, or in our world of AI, it would be in silico. Optimize that proof of concept for use in the real world. And then we go to translational research, where we first test the feasibility of that solution and then evaluate the efficacy in a more rigorous test, so typically a trial. And once all that has happened, we can go to implementation of the new intervention in clinical practice, so to routine use and scale and spread. I think diagrams like this definitely have a lot of merit because, by and large, this is obviously the journey that any new invention will have to undertake, including AI. This was not developed for AI specifically, clearly, but I think it still applies. But I also think it has some limitations. It's I think, very much conceptualize from looking at different research fields. So what we see here really are different research fields. And perhaps it's more about that than really how this journey of a new invention really unfolds. So there was a paper recently, earlier this year, published in NPJ Digital Medicine from Duke University, who actually described that journey for an AI system that they developed. So the system was called Sepsis Watch, and it was developed at Duke University, but then implemented at Duke University Health System. And what the paper does is really describe what happened over a 3-year time period to make that happen. And I thought it was really interesting because you see very little of these types of papers. I mean, perhaps it was the first that I saw, really. And the paper does a really good job in describing the complexity of making this happen. And what they do in the paper is essentially describe the entire journey through a series of swim lane diagrams that summarize what they call the algorithm journey map across 4 stages: problem identification, development, integration, and life cycle management. So I'm just going to give you a flavor of the paper. I'm not going to go into too much detail. One thing they do early on is to give a table with a description of each of the stakeholder that is listed in the swim lane diagrams. And I think this is really making the point about how many different types of stakeholders become involved if you're trying to do this. And that's also, I think, the main source of complexity, all those different stakeholders, and trying to understand what their role is and how you should involve them. And each of those swim lane diagrams then explains, which of these different stakeholders were involved in different stages and what they did and how they interacted. So this is step 2 in the journey, the development step. You can see that in the middle, you can probably not read this, but there's 2 green blocks there. So the first one is the one is build and validate the model, step 2A. And the second one is design workflow and prototype user interface, step 2B. And then there's further diagrams that specify the details of those 2 steps. But I thought it was interesting and telling to some extent that, in the entire journey, this is relatively small. All the other things are really the things that generate the complexity. And these are the 2 things that are probably relatively straightforward. But obviously, it's the ones that we tend to focus on quite a lot, certainly in research. So here's a diagram from a later stage, step 3A, integration and technical integration. And I thought that was also a very good illustration of the involvement of different groups. Over here, for instance, there was a lot of interaction with health system IT support, as you would expect. But that's what generated the complexity here. But in terms of takeaway points from this piece of work, I think what it demonstrates is that the translational journey for healthcare AI algorithms really follows the stages of the software development lifecycle. And that's not surprising if you think about it, because it is a piece of software that we're trying to bring to the real world. The other takeaway is that algorithm development and validation are relatively small and straightforward steps in this journey. The complexity really emerges from the large number of stakeholders that you have to involve. So we talk about clinicians, data scientists, designers, engineers, IT support, project managers, healthcare leadership, you name it. And I think also, and this is something that they do describe in the paper, that this journey is unexplored terrain for everyone. So there's not a single person who would be able to tell you who should be involved and what their role exactly is. So everyone is going to be a little bit confused about this. And this is also my own experience as well. And obviously that's something that tends to make things even more complex and also hold things up, because at some point you discover, oh, we should have talked to, stakeholder X, and we didn't do that, and now we have to go back to them. So looking at this paper, this is how I would probably describe the algorithm journey. And it follows, some of the steps that we've seen earlier, but it also has a couple of steps that perhaps we didn't see. So the first one, I think, which is really important and very often not made explicit, is the ideation phase, where we try to understand the problem and formulate an initial solution, at least how we see it, and try to figure out whether there's data available to support the development of that kind of solution. After that, we get the more familiar steps of, creating a proof of concept, validating that proof of concept or the model, developing then a minimum viable product, so something that is more than just a model, but also has a user interface, and basically consists of a clinical tool, a piece of software that embeds the AI model. Then we go to pilot deployment, where we integrate that into existing systems, into existing clinical workflows, go through the necessary regulatory assessments, including, for instance, assessing patient safety aspects, engage our user community, and evaluate the usability and adoption of the tool. So that's quite a critical stage, I would say. Once we've gone through that stage, we can go to a larger impact assessment, like a trial, for instance, evaluating the impact on clinical decision-making, patient outcomes, and on resources and costs. And once that's completed, we can deploy the solution at scale. I think if you were to ask me, so what in these journeys are the biggest stumbling blocks, then probably it's these two, so the regulatory assessment and the business continuity, mainly because these steps really require that you are well prepared. So once you're at the stage where you have to go through your regulatory assessment, you will realize, and I'm sure many of you have gone through this pain, that you should have documented everything that you've done to develop your product from day one. And also you should have set up a quality management system. If you haven't got those two things, you won't make it through this assessment. So if you're not familiar with this and you haven't done all those things, it's going to be extremely painful. It's very similar, I think, for the business continuity towards the end. It's something you have to think about essentially from day one, because you can't figure out how it will work at the very, very end. And then if you haven't got it, it means that your product is not going to stay because there's no business continuity. I think it's also really important to realize that whereas the flow of models is obviously from the top to the bottom in this diagram, the flow of knowledge is in the opposite direction. So learnings from later stages should be used to improve the approaches that we use in earlier stages. And I think that's exactly where things are going wrong at the moment, because so few models make it to those later stages. So that also means that we're not learning. We're not learning what works and what doesn't work in clinical practice. And therefore, we can't really improve what we're doing at the earlier stages. If you look at the different steps in this journey, then I think there are 4 for which we have good guidance, methodological guidance and reporting standards when it comes to AI at the very least. So for the development of the model, as well as the validation of the model, we've got statements like the tripod AI statement, which I think is really good. It focuses on clinical prediction models. For the pilot deployment, there's the Decide AI guideline, and for the impact assessment, there's the Concert AI extension. So that's for clinical trials. I think it's fair to say, as we've said before, the majority of studies focuses on the development of that proof of concept. and we have very few studies in the other categories, even though the guidance exists. I think the Decide AI guideline for the pilot deployment is really interesting. So that one appeared 2 years ago. I did a quick search yesterday to see, how many studies are citing that and what those studies are doing. And it was a bit disappointing because actually I didn't see many pilot studies citing that guideline. I saw many other types of papers citing it, but not pilot studies. And I think this is definitely a step which is vastly underreported. So people do it, people, develop their AI system and do some form of pilot deployment, but they don't report about it, at least not in the academic literature. And I think very often also people don't really see it as research. And I think that is something that should change. I think that's also very much true for the other 3 steps that we have here. So the ideation phase, the minimum viable product phase, and the deployment at scale phase. Again, I rarely, if ever, see papers that report on these steps. And that means that everyone who's trying to do it will reinvent the wheel because we're not learning anything from what others are doing. And I think that's a mistake. I think these steps are research as much as the other steps. And we should view them as such. So there should be guidance on how to do them. And we should stimulate people to report on these things. And probably that requires a conversation also with funders and with publishers. Only if we do that, we can get insight in all the different steps on this journey and hope to start doing things better than we are doing at the moment. I think it's also fair to say that, we can borrow from existing frameworks and theory in these areas that were perhaps not specifically developed for AI, but can still be very useful. And that is true definitely for the ideation phase, where we can, for instance, use co-design principles. And also for the other 2 phases, for the deployment at scale, for instance, there's the NAS framework from Fresh Greenhouse, which is really, really good. So that is definitely applicable and something that we can use also for healthcare AI. So it's not that we have to start from scratch. The problem is that at the moment, these steps are just not seen as research activities when it comes to healthcare AI. So moving on, here's a paper that was published earlier this year by Florian Markowicz, who's a colleague from me here in Cambridge. The slightly provocative title of this paper was "All models are wrong and yours are useless," for exactly the same reason that we've been discussing so far, that models are not being used. And Florian gives a checklist for useful clinical prediction tools. So what are the things that you need to do to be more successful and have more useful prediction tools? And it's very funny, which is exactly how Florian is. And he makes the point repeatedly is that you have to address a clear clinical decision point. So that's the first box, the first item on the checklist. But then number 3 is actually the same point. Do you address a clear clinical decision point? Are you sure? And number 5 is again checking, are you really, really sure about this? And I think he's right that this is underappreciated, how hard it is to get this right. And it's very often taken for granted. And that's why I also think that that first step, the ideation phase in the journey, is actually absolutely critical for success later on. So yeah, I very much agree with the point that Florian made in this paper. So let's go to the final bit. I'm conscious that, yeah, okay. Let's go to the final bit of the lecture, which is what do we know at the moment about healthcare AI implementation? Like I mentioned, we undertook a review of the literature earlier this year. And this was done for the EMEA Yearbook of Medical Informatics 2024. The paper is still to appear. Hopefully they managed to do it still in the calendar year 2024. Our paper is ready to go, but I think they're waiting for some others. What we did is we searched PubMed and Scopus for publications in 2022 and 2023 that focus on healthcare AI, clinical decision support, and implementation research. We found a total of 31 papers and categorized those into 4 groups. So the first group was implementation theories and frameworks, where we found 4 papers. The second one was stakeholder perspectives, 22 papers. The third group was implementation feasibility, 3 papers, and the final one, technical infrastructure for AI deployment, 2 papers. So what immediately springs out here is that most of the papers focused on stakeholder perspective, and there was very little work in those other areas. So that was quite interesting and a little bit disappointing, to be honest. And I think it aligns with what we were saying earlier. So that implementation feasibility step, I think, is very important, but very few people report on it. You find very few papers that say anything about that. So let's go through these 4 groups. So the first group was about implementation theories and frameworks. I think it's fair to say that there exists a wide variety of published implementation theories and frameworks, some of which are very mature, but they were not specifically developed for healthcare AI. That doesn't mean they're not applicable to healthcare AI. They definitely are, but they are very rarely used in healthcare AI implementation research. And when they are used, I don't think they are always used in the best possible way. So we found some studies that published in 2022 or 2023 that use, for instance, the technology acceptance model. It says framework here on the slide. It should be model, technology acceptance model. That is from 1989, and it has been superseded by newer frameworks like the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology from 2003. So that's 20 years, more than 20 years ago now. So we were a bit surprised to see that people still use the technology acceptance model. Clearly, they've not really followed the literature on this topic recently. Then the second group was about stakeholder perspectives. Like I said, this was the largest group, 22 papers. So many studies, typically assessing the perspective of stakeholders on healthcare AI through surveys, interviews, and focus groups. Most of these 22 studies were conducted prior to development of a concrete solution. So they really assessed the general acceptability of healthcare AI. So they were not really on the healthcare, on the AI algorithm journey, but more or less outside of it, asking people like, suppose that there would be an AI solution in your clinical field, how would you feel about that? And common barriers that were cited were things like fears to disruption to clinical workflows, fears of increased workload in general, lack of trust and familiarity with technology, and the lack of an evidence base for healthcare AI. We also found that there was a poor representation of stakeholder groups other than healthcare professionals. The majority of these 22 papers asked healthcare professionals what they found. I believe that we should ask the same question of, for instance, healthcare commissioners, healthcare regulators, and other groups, because they're equally important when it comes to the implementation of healthcare AI. And the third group was about implementation feasibility. So these were pilot studies, really, so where the Decide AI guidelines would be applicable. Like I mentioned, we found very few studies. I think it was 3. In the studies that were conducted, there was often a very poor interoperability between the AI system and other existing clinical systems. So, for instance, in one of those studies, the users, clinicians, had to manually enter all the information into the AI tool separately from having to enter it into, for instance, the electronic health record. That's not great. It tends to put people off tremendously, and that happened also in that particular study. Then in several of these studies, clinicians were not satisfied with the accuracy of the outputs of the AI algorithm. And I think in at least one case that could be traced back to poor data quality in existing clinical systems. So the AI had been developed on high quality data sets, but then once you bring it to frontline clinical practice, then you have to deal with the reality of clinical systems and for instance, electronic health records, which very often have quality issues. And it's not surprising then that the outputs of the AI are equally poor, because they will just reflect that poor data quality. But the result is that users are disappointed and just say, okay, I can't do anything with this. It's just not accurate. So I thought some really interesting learning here, and it's a shame that this area is so poorly reported, and that so few people actually do it, I guess, as well. Then the final group was about technical infrastructure. So this was really about, what is the technical infrastructure that is required for healthcare AI implementation? And again, we found very few studies on this topic. But what we did find from the ones that were published is that healthcare organizations very often lack the technical infrastructure and processes to integrate AI solutions. So if you're going through that journey, like the people from Duke University did, you'll find that, you're really up against some tough challenges, because there is no established infrastructure or process to help you to bring your AI solution to frontline clinical practice. When people did this, they often found that there were long delays in approvals to exchange protected health information, especially if they tried to use a system that was outside the healthcare organization where it was deployed. Then it makes it even harder to exchange that information. And other delays were caused by cybersecurity concerns. And all of this obviously is understandable, but it does make this journey at this stage very challenging, and very often it can cause very long delays. So let me finish with a couple of take-home messages. So I think it's fair to say that to date, most healthcare AI investment has focused on improving algorithm performance and developing proof of concepts, but not to delivering real-world impact of the AI. And that is true, I think, both for academic AI, healthcare AI investment, as well as industrial healthcare AI investment. The journey that a new AI algorithm has to undertake in order to make it to frontline clinical practice is complex. And I think the most challenging stages occur early, so understanding the problem, and late integration into healthcare practice. The steps in the middle, development and validation of the AI model, I think we know how to do that. It's not to say that it's trivial, but compared to the other steps, I don't think that's where we are currently facing challenges. It's in the other steps where we are struggling. Overall, I think that healthcare AI innovation research is still in its infancy and needs to grow and mature as a field in its own right. And particularly, we need to create a culture where we report on all the different steps along that journey, and not just a couple of those steps. So we have to see all those steps as research activities where we have to figure out what it is that works, what it is that doesn't work, and why that is. So I've included the references on this slide here. I'm happy to share my slides via John, so you can look those up if you're interested. And I'm going to finish here with thanking you, and a nice picture which was taken directly from the office from where I'm speaking to you. And when I showed this picture to Ruth Norris, I'm not sure if Ruth is on the call or not, she said, it looks like a care home. And that's probably true. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. We do have a little bit of time for some questions in the room or online if anybody's got any questions. If anyone's got a question online, please just raise your hand, so to speak, or in the room. I do have a question. So and yes.
Can you hear us okay, Neil?
If you
Yes, I can. Yep.
Oh,
Hi, Niels. Good to see you. And yeah, my question is, so I guess the problem with all scientific research is we don't reward publishing of negative results. So, you've said there around the lack of studies, things happening in both the ideation and kind of the minimal viable product, that kind of stage. So I would be interested, so what about all the ideas that were put there that were probably spent a lot of time on but got discounted? I mean, if they got published more, we would stop a lot more waste of time. But we don't, as a scientific community, with funding and all of those challenges, reward publishing of negative results. So how do we? It's a big question, but how do we get around that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. So, yeah, there's definitely many things that never made it. So at some point along the journey, things stopped, and then they weren't reported. Obviously, this is a general challenge that we have in academic research, that negative findings should be reported as well. It's not just true for AI, healthcare AI. I do think that if we create a culture where these steps are seen as reportable, as things where we can investigate and study and report on, that is already an important step forward. That could include that we tell people you should write a protocol first before you do it and publish that. That would give us at the very least some insight about the attempts that are being made, because you're right, at the moment it's a bit of a black hole. We really don't know what people have done. I think I'm fairly optimistic that once people recognize that this is something that you can publish about, that creates an incentive, and so that might create a change, that people will also publish things that didn't end very well, but at least it gives them a publication.
Have we got any other questions from in the room? Yes.
Yeah, so just a point about when you said that the framework for running these studies have changed, and you mentioned that some publications are still using the old framework, the technology acceptance model. Yeah, you just made a comment about the people using the old model weren't keeping up with the literature. I was wondering if you got any advice on best practices for doing that, getting my hands on literature and just keeping up with what's happening in the field.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I got that entirely. But I think what you're saying is that it's going to be a massive challenge for AI researchers to understand which kind of theories and frameworks exist when it comes to, in this case, technology acceptance. And you're right. I don't think we should expect that every AI researcher knows all of that. That's not feasible. So this is something where I think teams, multidisciplinary teams or interdisciplinary teams, will have to work together, as you would do anyway, right? So if you're serious about healthcare AI, you would always work, for instance, with people coming from a clinical background. You can't develop a piece of healthcare AI without involving clinicians. But I think it doesn't stop there. You have to involve also other people coming, for instance, from a human-computer interaction background and from an implementation background. So that team, that interdisciplinary team, is going to be quite big. Not everyone's going to be involved at all the different stages, but at some point you will need them. So yeah, I agree. It's not something we can expect from AI researchers, but we can expect them to work with others who are familiar with the latest developments in those fields.
I suppose this is about finding those teams. What's the best way to kind of what's the best way to enter the community and find those people in the first place and interact with them?
Could you hear that okay?
So I think the question was, how do you find those people? Is that correct?
Yes.
If I would still work in Manchester, I would say through the Pankhurst Institute. So because this is a talk in Manchester, that's what I will say.
Yeah, so this is my first time attending, so maybe it's difficult being around these kind of people. Yeah, trying to find the right papers. I've always kind of struggled with that. Finding, which ones are like gaining traction, and like which ones are actually the reputable ones. It'd just be good if there was a way to access that kind of information.
Thank you. Any other questions? I do have a quick question. Niels, one thing I was wondering about, I watched an interview the other day with a senior NHS clinician who was clearly getting rather annoyed with lots of people claiming that AI was going to be the magic bullet to fix the NHS. And he made it really clear. As far as he was concerned, the problem in the NHS right now is that the model of the NHS is too small for the population that we currently have. However, we all work in AI in the healthcare sector. Are there any particular areas that you think where AI is going to be able to make a clinical difference? Because we all know that, as researchers, we can come up with lots of stuff, but with your experience, what do you think will actually potentially get adopted in the next, as we move forward? Because the NHS clearly needs fixing. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I definitely think that there's more scope to consider and implement technologies that are actually not so much clinical, but help with administrative processes or supporting process, operational processes. Very often there is a clinical component to that. Think, for instance, triage. But yeah, it varies to what extent that's the case. But I do think that is where we can make tremendous improvements in the NHS and, for instance, relieve staff of administrative and operational duties. And I think there's a tendency to overlook how, what the opportunities are in that area and how much we could gain from it, because it's a little bit less sexy than supporting clinical decision making. So yeah, my answer would be, let's try to focus more on those, what I think is fairly low-hanging fruit and could really help the NHS to improve its productivity.
Thank you very much. Do we have any final questions? We have one from Tim.
Well, first, that's a fascinating overview. So thank you very much, Niels. You are pointing out the lack of sort of studies further down the translational pathway. And in my experience, one of the problems there is it just gets very expensive. It's relatively easy to do a pilot study, but as soon as you want to try and get it into clinical practice, the amount of money you require is much, much higher, and it's much harder to get grants to do that. Anything you'd like to comment about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's certainly, once you get to the trial stage, it's a different order of magnitude, the amount of money that you need. And obviously in the pathway for new medicines, all of that is paid for by pharmaceutical companies. And in AI, or I think in digital in general, we do not have the same culture, and also, less regulatory pressure to force companies to pay for these trials. So at the moment, very often it doesn't happen. I've seen quite a few companies who are selling technology, AI-based technology, to the NHS, making enormous claims about what the AI can do, and there's not a shred of evidence behind that. So personally, I think this is not something that we as academics can easily solve. It's really the regulators who have to step in and say, look, before any technology is being adopted at scale in the NHS, we need solid evidence that it actually brings benefits, that it's worth the investment. And that would force companies to pay for those trials. It will be very hard to do it anyway else, I think.
Thanks for the question, Tim. Any final last questions? Neil, thank you very much for joining us today. Really, really interesting talk. We really, really appreciate you taking the time. It's lovely to hear what you've been up to for a little bit since you left Manchester. So thank you very much. So one last time, thank you very much, Neil. As Neil said, he's going to send his slides over. If that's okay, I'll forward those to the list. I've also made a note of one of the papers that you mentioned in the talk. I will forward that out via the list server email address. And if anybody's on this call, by the way, who wants to be on the list server address, if you just email me at john.parkinson@manchester.ac.uk, send me your email and I'll put you on the mailing list for this. Niels, thanks again. Hopefully we'll see you on campus soon. We'll bring this to a close and we have coffee and donuts. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.